is the taxpayer when you can choose to be a taxpayer or not.
It may be perfectly legal in your country. It's just not legal in our country.
How can you explain this apparent injustice where I'm paying taxes and Starbucks is not, or Google is not, or Amazon, or Walmart, or whoever you want to put on your list?
There is an entire industry of lawyers and accountants and professionals, private bankers, corporate service providers who are devising the next good offshore tax scheme.
It can't be that you can be in a big organization that's complicated, and because it's big and complicated, you get away with it. But the kid who steals the apple gets caught and punished because everybody understands his crime.
There are exact parallels with the mafia. That is why I call them the pinstripe mafia.
There was a time when tax havens embraced that term, we are tax havens. And then as people began to look upon tax havens as not being a good thing, they started referring to themselves as offshore financial centers.
It's not acceptable that people can obtain anonymity and then do whatever they want to do. If we do that, we're basically back to the Middle Ages with a ruling class that can hide and the rest of us suffering the consequences.
What they're really doing is helping people commit crimes against their own government.
We see corporations that pay only 2% tax, whilst ordinary citizens pay 30 or 40% tax. We see small businesses paying much higher taxes than global multinational corporations.
Do I, as an individual, have a right to say to my state, you have claimed me as a taxpayer. You must also claim Google, or Amazon, Starbucks. You must also claim them as taxpayers. And if you can't or won't do that as a state, and I think we are at a place where we say won't, not can't, if states choose not to do that, do they not then have a responsibility to explain why?
We've seen it in the banking crisis. The private sector went and built an empire on derivatives, extracted a lot of money from people around the world, and then went bust. The general public was then asked to come up with the money to make them whole again.
This concept of absolute total financial secrecy just has to go.
When will the government fully realize that we've sort of come to a stage in the globalization process where things have gotten a little bit too much out of hand?
The state has to shut down corporations which produce harmful products. You can't imagine somebody selling food or medicine or water which harms society and being allowed to remain in business. But that simply does not happen with accountancy firms, and I think the reason is that they enjoy political protection. They have inside track into government departments.
If regular folks decide, yeah, we were just really excited about your product, but now that we know that, you know, you're not paying your taxes, we're not going to buy it anymore. That is tough stuff.
There's nothing legitimate about consciously, knowingly, intentionally helping citizens of other countries evade their responsibilities or violate criminal laws, all in the name of money.
It's not that we not know what is happening. We know. We are a member of a network of over 800 organizations in Publish What You Pay, in over 70 countries in the world who are harmed by this. There is a connection between why the biggest gold mine, for example, in South America is losing money and why we're not able to see the cost side. Why is the biggest gold company in South America losing money? Why can't we see the cost side? There's a connection with criminal drug networks that are able to capture politics in Mexico, and where 43 innocent students have disappeared. It is relevant to know where criminal networks and those who can use anonymity can hide their financial proceeds. And financial proceeds from crime can easily be converted into something else because of the secrecy. There is a connection. Some countries are hurt more than other countries. They're paying a higher cost. International financial flows from developing countries, estimations giving from 500 to 1,000 billion US dollars per year. And it exceeds the net capital inflow to the developing world and many times the overseas development assistance. IMF estimates a possible 10 to 15% revenue loss. This is lost financing for development through profitable private and public investments in a world with increasing inequality. Talking about inequality, rich countries are not protected either. Economic equality has risen to pre-World War I levels in the developed world and expected to continue. It's overall linked to unequal sharing of gains from increase in productivity between labor and capital, taken from Piketty. The way we handled the global crisis and the euro crisis contributed further to increase inequality in several countries and has de facto facilitated a transfer of wealth from the state and the majority of the population to the richest. The situation is even worse because Piketty doesn't touch upon the offshore economy that has increased to unprecedented historical levels, or the increasing element of south-north net capital flows through offshore accounts. Everybody knows the system is broken, yet many are turning their blind eye and continue to limp on. But there are steps that we can take. It will not solve all the problems in the world, but we could get some facts and figures on the table that could help us to ask some relevant questions. The Public What You Pay network has contributed and been a driving force in getting Dodd-Frank legislation in the US and the EU directive. It's a historical effort. It's currently underway to achieve transparency globally. But despite its great success, it can do little with tax avoidance. These represent minimum requirements. That is because a tax payment seen in isolation, it's very difficult to relate that to anything. What can that really tell us? So what we have proposed is to move beyond a minimum transparency standard by including the US and the EU standard and make such reporting into a meaningful standard. To do that, tax payments need to have a logical context. Also, the reporting must be linked to financial accounts in the companies, and it has to be true for all countries. What is the status in Norway? Politicians say, in public, they all want to fight tax avoidance. For obvious reasons, it's very hard for any politician to say they are for corruption and tax avoidance. But lack of action has that consequence. We are very close in Norway to a law that could address what is missing and which could get some facts and some figures on the table. We have a litigation in the US. We have different other actors and interest groups that are in a run-up trying to hinder what we propose. Therefore, 3 critical elements are still missing. On the one side, you see the basic country-by-country reporting, as in US and the EU. On the other side, you see the proposed extended requirements to a country-by-country reporting. The 3 remaining red flags are costs, it's accounting figures, it's to have no exemptions for using tax havens. Why should any reporting hide costs? If a company had reported its costs as a part of its extended country-by-country reporting, the advantage is that the society would have gained an insight into income, cost, profit, and tax and could relate it to one another. This would have enabled examination of how income and tax relate to investment and cost. Why should reporting be detached from the annual financial statement? Right now, we have a formulation which is merely requesting a consolidation. The most logical approach, which all users of financial information would like, is to obtain financial information from the audited financial statements in a company. The wording may seem ingenious, but it has many implications in the terms of what the public will actually be able to see. The advantage is that it can be done so cheaply and presented in notes to the accounts. This would ensure that only real audited accounting figures are reported. Why should the reporting only address or involve countries where the physical extraction of natural resources are taken out, when we know that a majority of trade is related to financial transactions? Tax havens are reported as support functions. Company currently only have to report what is outside the tax havens. Tax havens are not support functions. They are main functions, soliciting corruption and tax avoidance. We've demonstrated that the extractive industry are major users of financial instruments that can be misused to transfer income out of countries before it's taxed. Tax havens also represent a money laundering mechanism and contribute to tax flight from resource-rich but poor countries. Currently, we have allowed for other exemptions with no restrictions, meaning that it opens up the possibility for any exemption at any time whatsoever. This loophole should be closed. The advantage would be that you would get comparable data across all countries. That would be statistic for development. Lack of transparency harms people. We have with us today 21 participants from our TRACE program from Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia. We have been discussing these issues for 10 long and intense days. Yesterday, we were in the parliament so that they could ask Norwegian politicians why Norwegian politicians are not implementing laws that could make transparency possible in their countries. Do they have to be bled dry by multinational enterprises and authoritarian regimes? The absence of such requirements is an obstacle to good governance, is an obstacle to get rid of corrupt regimes, is an obstacle to a democratic development, and it holds back all efforts to prevent tax flight. The first part of the program today, from 9 to 12, will look at actions to address tax avoidance. One process many refer to is the OECD. What can the OECD do to hinder tax avoidance? We're happy to have with us Grace Perez Navarro. She's the deputy in the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. She has held key roles in the OECD since 1997, with responsibilities for tax crime, for money laundering, for bank secrecy, and more. We asked her to come and give us a keynote speech because the OECD has recently presented an action plan, 7 elements in an action plan to prevent tax flight. Finalization of the document will be ready in 2015. We asked her which points are most important to hinder tax avoidance. Can it do that? Of course, we think that OECD reports in this version, halfway, suffers from some weaknesses. But on the bright side, the OECD is only halfway in its process. And we hope that there will be a process where those affected by this policy can be given a chance to be heard. We must take both global and national steps to fight tax avoidance. Last year, Hans Christian Holte became our new tax director in Norway. And already he had sent over 100 co-workers out on a treasure hunt, investigating multinational companies. And he's already found 14 billion Norwegian kroner that were not taxed. What do they expect to find? What are you going to do? Our third keynote speaker, unfortunately, has to be excused because of death in close family. Our tax director will instead answer a few questions for you. We also have a part 2 program from 11 to 12. We look forward to having a political debate with members of the Financial Committee. We're happy that they're here with us in very intense, long days in budget discussions. We want to say and to ask them about multinational companies that use secrecy market mechanisms to keep capital away from the open market. Will they close the loopholes in the Norwegian law? Will they make companies report cost, accounting figures for all countries without exemptions? In order to frame the Norwegian political debate, we have with us Frian Årsnes. He's a chairman in PWYP Norway with 25 years experience in Norwegian and international strategies, analysis, modeling, tax and fiscal systems in the oil industry. To monitor the debate and to be the red thread today is Aslak Bonde, a political analyst, extensive experience from journalism, previous politician, has worked in a variety of national news channels, NRK and Aftenposten, and runs the webpage politicalanalysis.no. He has led a number of important debates, and we're happy that he will lead the debate with us today. Last, I would like to say that it would be very good if you could join the debate and ask questions to speakers and politicians using the Twitter account PWYP Norway, perhaps the Policy Not Secrecy and Skattehøsten hashtags, before we enter into an exciting part 3 in the program, which we are very honored to be hosting together with NorLAR-Net, Professor Benedicte Bull from the Norwegian Latin American Research Network, with researcher Marielle Christina Aguilar Støren from the Center Development and Environment, will moderate a conversation with 4 participants from Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia and Guatemala, and address the question, what are the local consequences of the industry of tax avoidance?